Welcome, everybody, to History Analyzed. I'm your host, Mark Palmer. This is a podcast which examines historic events, issues, and people. The person we're analyzing today is Amelia Earhart, the most famous female pilot in history. She was breaking the glass ceiling decades before anybody had coined that term. In the 1920s and 30s, she was setting records, not just for women, but for everybody. With all of the incredible feats that she accomplished, she is most remembered for the supposedly mysterious way that she died. On July 2, 1937, Earhart and her navigator, Fred Noonan, simply disappeared someplace in the Pacific Ocean. They and their airplane were never seen again. We'll get into the way they died later on. Let's start with a short biography. Amelia Earhart was born on July 24, 1897, in Atchison, Kansas. In 1918, she worked as a nurse's aide in Toronto, tending to World War I soldiers. After the war, she went to Columbia University in New York City in a pre-med program. She decided medicine was not for her and dropped out. She moved to California, where her parents were living, and took her first plane ride in 1920. She immediately knew this is what she wanted to do. She took flying lessons before she knew how to drive a car. On May 16, 1923, she received an international pilot's license from the Fédération Aéronautique Internationale. She was only the 16th woman to earn such a license. For years, she avoided marriage because she did not want to give up her flying career. Eventually, she met a man who would agree to marriage on her terms. She married George Palmer Putnam on February 7, 1931. On that very day, before she married him, she handed him a typed letter. She addressed it, "Dear GPP," his initials. Here's what that letter said. "There are some things which should be writ before we are married, things we have talked over before, most of them. You must know again my reluctance to marry, my feeling that I shatter thereby chances in work which means most to me. I feel the move just now as foolish as anything I could do. I know there may be compensations, but have no heart to look ahead. On our life together, I want you to understand I shall not hold you to any medieval code of faithfulness to me, nor shall I consider myself bound to you similarly. If we can be honest, I think the difficulties which arise may best be avoided should you or I become interested deeply, or in passing, in anyone else. Please let us not interfere with the other's work or play, nor let the world see our private joys or disagreements. In this connection, I may have to keep some place where I can go to be myself now and then, for I cannot guarantee to endure at all times the confinement of even an attractive cage. I must exact a cruel promise, and that is, you will let me go in a year if we find no happiness together. I will try to do my best in every way and give you that part of me you know and seem to want." She signed it, A.E. I've been married to my wife Cindy for 37 years. I could not imagine having a marriage start with such a letter like Amelia gave to George. They did stay married until she died 6 years later. Putnam not only agreed that she would continue her aviation career, but he also was her biggest promoter. Earhart never had any children. There were rumors that she had an affair with a man named Jean Vidal. I don't know if it's true. The primary source of this rumor was Vidal's son, who also happens to be one of my favorite authors, Gore Vidal. Earhart started flying at a time when there were so few opportunities for women. The 19th Amendment to the Constitution, which gave women the right to vote nationwide, was finally ratified on August 18, 1920. It was not until the Civil Rights Act of 1957 that women were finally allowed to serve on federal juries, and that was only for federal courts. It wasn't until 1968 that the last state, Mississippi, permitted women to serve on juries and state courts. Women did not have equal rights with banks or other creditors in the U.S. until the Equal Credit Opportunity Act of 1974. Up until that time, most credit card companies would require a man to co-sign for a woman for her to get a credit card. So you could see how amazing it was that a woman was achieving these things in the 1920s and 1930s. Some of Earhart's career was tied, at least in the mind of the public, to Charles Lindbergh. Most people think that Lindbergh was the first person to fly across the Atlantic. Not true. The first nonstop flight across the Atlantic occurred on June 14, 1919. British aviators John Alcock and Arthur Whitten Brown are not remembered, but they were the first. Alcock was the pilot and Brown was the navigator. They did it in a biplane. They took off from St. John's, Newfoundland, and landed in Clifton, Ireland. When you read about that flight, you might notice that they always describe the takeoff point as Newfoundland and not Canada. That's because Newfoundland wasn't part of Canada at the time. Canada became a country in 1867, but Newfoundland remained an independent country within the British Commonwealth and did not join Canada until 1949. The reason they took off from Newfoundland was because it's the closest part of mainland North America to Europe. I don't know why Alcock and Brown didn't become famous, but for some reason, they're not remembered like Charles Lindbergh. A New York City hotel owner named Raymond Ortigue offered a $25,000 prize for the first successful nonstop flight between New York and Paris, a longer flight than Newfoundland to Ireland. Several aviators died trying to claim that prize. In 1927, 25-year-old Charles Lindbergh did it, and he did it flying solo, no navigator or co-pilot. Supposedly, he decided to fly solo to reduce weight, so his plane could fly a longer distance on the same amount of fuel. His airplane was called the Spirit of St. Louis because his financial backers were from St. Louis, Missouri. Lindbergh took off from Roosevelt Field on Long Island on May 20, 1927. He flew for 33 and a half hours before he landed in Paris at Le Bourget Aerodrome at 10:22 p.m. Paris time on May 21. Lindbergh became a worldwide sensation. 1 year after Lindbergh, Amelia Earhart became the first woman to fly across the Atlantic Ocean. She joined aviators Wilmer Stultz and Lewis Gordon in that transatlantic flight. They left Newfoundland on June 17, 1928, and landed in Wales on June 18. She really wanted to pilot the aircraft at least part of the way, but she was not given the opportunity. She was simply a passenger on the flight. And when I say that, I do not mean to diminish her accomplishment. This was a brave thing to do. Many died trying to cross the Atlantic. On May 8, 1927, two French aviators named Charles Nougasset and François Colly attempted to fly the opposite direction from Paris to New York. They disappeared somewhere over the Atlantic. I could not find an exact number, but at least one source stated that 15 or more people died in the 1920s trying to fly across the Atlantic Ocean. It was the 1928 flight across the Atlantic that made Amelia Earhart famous around the world. After that flight, she accomplished a lot of feats as a pilot, not as a passenger. She set some speed records and placed third in the 1929 Women's Air Derby from Santa Monica to Cleveland. That was the first cross-country race for female pilots. In 1931, Earhart was the first woman to fly an autogyro. And in case you're wondering, what the heck is an autogyro? I never heard of it either until I read some books about Amelia Earhart. It looked like a cross between an airplane and a helicopter. It had enormous rotor blades that were horizontal with the ground and above the craft, like a helicopter has, but it seems that those rotor blades were not powered. The autogyro also had wings and a propeller in front. Earhart set an altitude record in the autogyro. Earhart's celebrity was partly attributable to George Putnam. Even before they got married, he was crucial in promoting all of her exploits. He was a publisher. Because of Putnam, she wrote a book about her 1928 flight across the Atlantic titled 20 Hours and 40 Minutes. Putnam arranged for Earhart to lecture around the country in support of aviation as well as careers for women. There were other female pilots who were also famous at the time, but George Putnam made sure that Amelia Earhart was the most well-known female pilot in the world. Amelia Earhart was the first woman to fly solo across the Atlantic. In fact, she was the second person of either gender to fly solo across the Atlantic. For her flight, she chose a bright red Lockheed Vega 5B airplane. You can see that plane at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. She took off from Harbor Grace in Newfoundland on May 20, 1932. That was exactly 5 years to the day after Lindbergh took off on his historic flight. Her flight covered just over 2,000 miles or 3,200 kilometers. She flew for just under 15 hours. Whenever I am researching an episode, I bombard my wife Cindy with all of these facts that I find so interesting. When I told her that Earhart flew for almost 15 hours, Cindy's first question was, how did she pee? I never thought about it. I tried to find the answer, but I've been unable to do so. It had to be rough because she had to hold on to the controls the entire time. I guess this will remain a mystery. Besides the bathroom issue, Earhart had a lot of other things on her mind on that flight. At one point, she noticed ice developing on her wings, which finally melted at a lower elevation, which was warmer. She also noticed flames coming out of the engine at one point. That had to be alarming, flying over open ocean with no land in sight. But the engine held on, and she made it to Europe. Earhart had planned to land in Paris, but when she touched down in a field, she did not know where she was. She asked the farmer, "Where am I?" She was surprised to find out that she was in Northern Ireland. She was so far off course because of the weather conditions. After the 1932 solo flight across the Atlantic, Earhart said, "It was, in a measure, a self-justification, proving to me and to anyone else interested that a woman with adequate experience could do it." A few months later, Amelia Earhart made history again. On August 24 to 25, 1932, she flew that same red Lockheed Vega nonstop across the United States. This was another first for a woman. She flew from Los Angeles to Newark, New Jersey. The flight took just over 19 hours and covered a distance of 2,447 miles or 3,938 kilometers. By the way, I've had people ask me why I give measurements in metric as well as the feet and miles of the U.S. customary units in my episodes. Even though I live in Los Angeles, for most episodes, only approximately 65% of my audience is in the United States. For the other 35% of my audience, I give metric measurements. On January 11, 1935, Amelia Earhart became the first person to fly solo between California and Hawaii. And I said first person, not just the first woman. She flew from Hawaii to Oakland, California. The flight took 18 hours. She wasn't the first to fly between Hawaii and California. In 1927, 2 men flew from California to Hawaii, but Earhart was the first to fly solo and nonstop between Hawaii and California. Today, Amelia Earhart is mostly famous for her attempt to fly around the world in 1937. She would not be the first to do so. American aviator Wiley Post did it twice. He was the first person to circumnavigate the globe in an airplane from June 23 to July 1, 1931. He flew with a navigator named Harold Gatty. 2 years later, Post flew solo around the world from July 15 to July 22, 1933. I cannot comprehend why he did not become more famous than Charles Lindbergh, but he did not. In both of his flights, Wiley Post flew a fairly northern route. In his first flight in 1931, he started off from Roosevelt Field on Long Island. There were many stops for fuel, food, and rest. His first stop was Harbor Grace, Newfoundland. Although he did not plan on stopping in Britain, he landed in Chester, England because of weather problems. Post and his navigator didn't know what country they were in until they landed. The next scheduled stop was Berlin, but they landed in Hanover, Germany because they got lost. Then they flew from Hanover to Berlin. The next stop was Moscow. Then they flew to Novosibirsk. Of course, everyone knows where that is, right? Okay, I had to look it up. It's in Siberia. Since Siberia is enormous, the next 3 stops were also in Siberia at Irkutsk, Blagovershansk, and Khabarovsk. They finally left Siberia, and the next stop was at Solomon Beach near Nome, Alaska. At that time, Alaska was not a state. It was part of the U.S., but just a territory. It was not until January 3, 1959, that Alaska became the 49th state. Alaska is also huge, so the next stop was still within Alaska at Fairbanks. Then it was on to Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. From there, they flew to Cleveland. After Cleveland, they made their return to New York for the end of their flight. When Wiley Post flew solo around the world in 1933, the route he took was pretty much the same as the 1931 trip. Although the solo flight started and ended at Floyd Bennett Field in Brooklyn. But both trips traversed the Northern Hemisphere through Europe, Russia, Alaska, and Canada. The first flight with the navigator in 1931 took over 8 days and covered 15,474 miles or 24,903 kilometers. The solo flight in 1933 took over 7 days and covered 15,596 miles or 25,099 kilometers. I am not belittling the incredible achievements of Wiley Post. I think he was amazing and deserves to be remembered. But his course was much shorter because he took such a northern route. Look at a globe. It's a lot shorter to go around the Earth the closer you are to either of the poles. Think about it. If you were close enough to either the North or South Pole, you could technically go around the world in less than a single mile or kilometer. The reason I bring this up is because Amelia Earhart decided that she would try to circumnavigate the Earth as close to the equator as possible. The route Earhart proposed would cover approximately 29,000 miles or 47,000 kilometers. That is almost 2 times the distance Wiley Post flew. Earhart needed a new plane for this adventure. Her husband arranged for Purdue University to donate $50,000. That would be equivalent to somewhere over $1 million today. Earhart was a visiting faculty member at Purdue as a career counselor for women and a technical advisor in the Department of Aeronautics. The plane she purchased was a Lockheed 10E Electra. It had twin engines. Of course, those were propeller engines because jet engines were not yet on aircraft. It was an all-aluminum plane. It looked very cool because it had twin tails on it. I found an article about this plane on the Lockheed Martin website. That article stated that originally there was one tail on the Lockheed Electra, but wind tunnel tests showed it to be unstable, so they changed it to 2 tails. As it says on the website, not only did the twin-tail version far outperform the initial design, it became a signature Lockheed design repeated in other Lockheed models. Earhart would not fly solo. She would have a navigator. Actually, she originally planned on having 2 navigators. She ended up using just one, which I'll explain later on. The biggest problem was flying across the Pacific Ocean. According to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the Pacific Ocean covers more than 30% of the entire Earth. It has a surface area of more than 60 million square miles or 155 million square kilometers. The Pacific Ocean is larger than the land mass of all the continents combined. The point of all this is that it is incredibly hard to fly across the Pacific Ocean. Amelia Earhart planned on flying westward in her journey around the Earth. Fortunately, Hawaii is kind of in the middle of the Pacific and would provide her with a convenient first stop. The problem was where to go from there. Her plane could not go the distance from Hawaii to the mainland of Asia. She needed a place to stop and refuel. She picked Howland Island because it was the only viable option. On March 17, 1937, Amelia Earhart took off from Oakland, California, bound for Hawaii. She was accompanied by 3 men on this flight to Hawaii: Paul Mantz, Fred Noonan, and Harry Manning. Mantz was only flying that first leg of the trip from Oakland to Hawaii. Mantz had helped Earhart modify the plane for such a long journey, including the extra fuel tanks. I could not find a definitive answer why he only flew that one part of the trip, but it seems that he flew to Hawaii because he was very familiar with the Lockheed Electra and would be able to assist with any repairs or modifications that seemed necessary after that first leg of the flight. For whatever reason, Mantz was not on the Lockheed Electra when it took off from Ford Island in the middle of Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, on March 20, 1937. Earhart, Noonan, and Manning were the 3 people on board. When they tried to take off for the flight to Howland Island, there was a crash. I've read different accounts of the incident, but here's the way it was described by a United States Army Board of Investigation. After a run of 1,200 feet, the airplane crashed on the landing mat due to collapse of the landing gear as a result of an uncontrolled ground loop. The lack of factual evidence makes it impossible to establish the reason for the ground loop. That as a result of the crash, the airplane was damaged to an extent requiring major overhaul. I kept finding references to a ground loop, but I had no idea what that meant. Here's the definition from Merriam-Webster.com for a ground loop: a sharp, uncontrollable turn made by an aircraft on the ground and usually caused by an unbalanced drag as from a wingtip touching the ground. Some people blame the accident on Earhart, but it seems that overall most feel that it was not caused by pilot error. To the contrary, Earhart did a good job of saving the aircraft and the 3 people on board. But because of the damage sustained on March 20, the Electra was sent back to Oakland by boat for major repairs. After the plane was restored, some changes were made for the flight. The first is that Harry Manning would no longer accompany Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan. I've read conflicting reasons for this. Some people claim that Manning no longer trusted Earhart's piloting skills after the crash on the takeoff in Hawaii. But from what I have read, that does not seem to be true. It was simply a matter of having to get back to his regular job. Manning was a master mariner and captain for United States Lines. He commanded ocean liners. It seems that this guy was an expert in naval matters as well as aviation. Manning had taken a leave of absence in January 1937 to serve as one of the 2 navigators for Earhart's circumnavigation of the globe. After the crash on March 20, it was clear that extensive repairs were going to be necessary to the Lockheed Electra. His leave of absence did not allow for him to wait around for a few more months for a second attempt on the flight. Harry Manning was proficient in Morse code, but neither Fred Noonan nor Amelia Earhart were skilled in using Morse code. As a result, Earhart relied on voice communications over the radio throughout this trip around the world. On the day she went missing, perhaps Morse code could have been useful when the radio communications broke down, as I'll describe later. Fred Noonan would be the only navigator on this trip. That seemed reasonable. Noonan was one of the best navigators in the world at that time. He was 44 years old. For over 20 years, he served on various ships and learned navigation. Then he changed careers to aviation. Noonan worked as a navigator for Pan American World Airways, commonly just called Pan Am. He was the navigator for several of the Pan Am flights across the Pacific. Noonan had a pilot's license. I was unable to find how much experience he actually had as a pilot, but it seems it was nowhere close to that of the experience of Amelia Earhart. Once the plane had been fully repaired, it was time for a second attempt to fly around the world. The proposed route around the globe would essentially be the same, except for going in the opposite direction. Instead of flying westward around the Earth, they would be flying eastward. Why did they change the direction? It was because of the weather and the prevailing winds. They determined that it would be better to fly westward when they were leaving in March, but for late spring and early summer, it would be better to fly in an easterly direction. On May 20, 1937, Earhart and Noonan left Oakland. They made stops in Burbank, Tucson, New Orleans, and Miami. On June 1, they flew from Miami to San Juan, Puerto Rico. Then they flew to South America with stops in Carapito, Venezuela, Paramaribo, which is the capital of Suriname, and 2 stops in Brazil at Fortaleza and Natal. In case you're wondering why she flew so far south, it was for 2 reasons. Number 1, her goal was to circumnavigate the Earth as close as possible to the equator. Number 2, the distance from eastern Brazil to the closest part in Africa is fairly close at approximately 1,800 miles or 2,900 kilometers. Fun fact, the easternmost point of Brazil is much closer to Africa than to the westernmost point of Brazil. Ponta do Cxs in Brazil is the easternmost point in all of the mainland Americas. The distance from that spot to the westernmost point in Brazil is over 2,600 miles or 4,300 kilometers. That is much farther than the distance to Africa. Anyway, that's why they flew across the Atlantic from Brazil to Africa. They landed in St. Louis in modern-day Senegal. The reason I say what modern-day country a city is located in is because in 1937, almost all of Africa was either a European colony or part of the British Commonwealth, like South Africa. With one exception, Liberia was a fully independent country. Ethiopia, called Abyssinia at the time, had been independent but was occupied by fascist Italy beginning in 1935. I did an episode called The Scramble for Africa, which explains the colonization of that continent by the Europeans. A lot of the places where Earhart and Noonan landed in Asia were also European colonies in those days. But to make it easier, I'm just going to refer to those cities in their current countries. Getting back to the flight to Africa, they did not mean to land at St. Louis. They were planning on landing in Dakar, which I hear pronounced both as Dakar and Dakar. They missed their intended target of Dakar because of the severe weather and poor visibility crossing the Atlantic. Keep this in mind when they go missing later. They flew from St. Louis to Dakar, which is the capital of modern Senegal. Here's another fun fact. Dakar is the westernmost point of mainland Africa. From Dakar, they flew across Africa with stops in Gao, Mali, Fort Lamy, which is now known as N'Djamena, the capital of Chad, Al-Fashir and Khartoum in Sudan, and Massawa and then Assab. Both are port cities on the Red Sea in Eritrea. One of those city names might have sounded familiar to you. Khartoum is the capital of Sudan, but movie lovers might recognize Khartoum as the name of the horse in The Godfather. Yes, the horse that gets his head chopped off and placed into the bed of that Hollywood producer who would not give Don Corleone's godson the role in his next movie. Earhart and Noonan left Africa and landed in Karachi, Pakistan. From there, they flew to Calcutta, India, then to Akyab and Rangoon, both in Myanmar, next to Bangkok, Thailand, then on to the city-state of Singapore. After Singapore, they made 3 stops in what was then called the Dutch East Indies and is now known as Indonesia, at Bandung, Surabaya, and Kupang. And in case you're wondering why they had to make 3 separate stops in Indonesia, it's because that country is enormous. It's an archipelago that stretches over 3,000 miles or 5,000 kilometers west to east across approximately 17,000 islands. Now Earhart and Noonan only had 4 more stops to make before returning to California. They next went to Darwin, Northern Territory, Australia. A lot of people don't realize that the Japanese bombed Australia during World War II. There were several attacks in the Northern Territory, Western Australia, and Queensland, but Darwin got it the worst. When Earhart and Noonan left Australia, they went to Lae, that's spelled L-A-E, in Papua New Guinea. When they left Lae on July 2, 1937, that was the last time anybody saw Earhart or Noonan. Their next scheduled stop was Howland Island. If they made it there, then they would fly to Hawaii and then back here to California. When they were originally going to fly westward around the world, they were going to take care of the most dangerous part of the trip right at the beginning. They always knew that finding Howland Island was going to be very difficult, but they needed a place to land and refuel. Howland Island is a U.S. possession. It was discovered by the Americans at some point in the early 1800s. In 1857, it was claimed by the United States. It is tiny, only about 0.6 square miles or 1.6 square kilometers. Imagine trying to find such a small speck of land in the enormous Pacific Ocean with 1930s technology. And to make it harder to find, the highest point on the island is only about 10 feet or 3 meters above sea level. So it's not like there's a mountain or something that you can spot from far away. Howland is now an uninhabited national wildlife refuge. In the mid to late 1800s, American and British companies mined guano on Howland Island. In case you're not familiar with that term, guano is accumulated excrement from seabirds or bats used for fertilizer. Apparently, there was a lot of bird poop on Howland Island, and it must have been valuable fertilizer to make it economically viable for American and British companies to send ships and people all the way there to extract it. There is another island approximately 42 miles or 68 kilometers away from Howland Island. That is Baker Island, which is also an uninhabited U.S. territory. It's close to the same size as Howland at approximately 0.8 square miles or 2.1 square kilometers. Howland was chosen as a refueling stop because the U.S. government built 3 runways on the island. Most sources I read claim that the runways were built specifically for Amelia Earhart. However, according to the Living New Deal website, students from Hawaii went to Howland Island in 1935 to conduct research as part of a New Deal project. If you're not familiar with the New Deal, that was President Franklin Roosevelt's program to battle the Great Depression involving, among other things, public works projects. The 3 runways were built with $3,000 from the Works Progress Administration, part of FDR's New Deal. The purpose of these runways was for a refueling station for trans-Pacific flights. Of course, this is what interested Amelia Earhart. She asked President Roosevelt to expedite the runway construction on Howland. I don't know what her relationship was like with FDR, but by 1935, Earhart was already friends with the First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt. I found a telegram online dated January 16, 1935, from Eleanor Roosevelt to Earhart. It says, "When you come to Washington, will you and your husband, if he is with you, stay with us? Let us know as much ahead as you can. Congratulations again." Now let's discuss how Noonan and Earhart navigated around the world. It's not like today with global positioning satellites. Nowadays, you can pull out your phone and find your exact location. It was very different in 1937. Fred Noonan used two different types of navigation systems. One was dead reckoning. That is a navigating system which began in the 1200s. Dead reckoning relied on four criteria. Number one, starting position. Number two, compass course. Number three, speed. And number four, elapsed time. Here's an example of how dead reckoning worked. Earhart and Noonan knew where they had left. In the case of the final flight, it would be Lae, Papua New Guinea. From maps, they knew the compass direction where they expected to find Howland Island. Compass direction is described as a 3-digit number. When you watch TV or movies, on a ship or a plane, the captain will say, "Set a course for 073. What does that mean? 0 degrees is directly north, meaning headed towards the North Pole. Then they use up to 359 degrees to come back around to due north for a total of 360 degrees. If 0 degrees is directly north, this means 90 degrees is due east, 180 degrees is heading exactly south towards the South Pole, and 270 degrees is due west. So a course of 073 would be generally a little north of due east. The reason I picked a heading of 073 is because that is the course that Earhart and Noonan would take from Lae, Papua New Guinea, to Howland Island. So if they knew where they started from and they knew what course they were taking, they just needed to calculate the speed and the elapsed time from when they took off. I just measured on Google Maps. The distance from Lae, Papua New Guinea, to Howland Island is around 2,590 miles or 4,168 kilometers. In calculating the speed of the aircraft, I've read differing figures because Earhart probably flew at differing speeds between Lae, Papua New Guinea, and Howland Island. But it seems that Earhart flew generally at approximately 150 to 160 miles per hour, true airspeed, or 240 to 257 kilometers per hour. That is airspeed, not ground speed. What's the difference? Airspeed measures an airplane's speed relative to the surrounding air. Ground speed measures its speed over the ground, meaning how many miles or kilometers along the ground were being covered per hour. Ground speed factors in wind speed, meaning a strong tailwind can increase an aircraft's ground speed beyond its airspeed. And of course, the opposite is true, that a strong headwind would decrease the airplane's ground speed from its airspeed. And that is what the Lockheed Electra was facing on that fateful day. Earhart and Noonan calculated that it would take approximately 18 hours to reach Howland Island, using dead reckoning. As long as Earhart kept to the proper compass setting of 073, after 18 hours, they should see Howland Island. In addition to dead reckoning, Fred Noonan also used aeronautical celestial navigation. That is a method of navigating a plane or determining its position using celestial bodies, primarily the sun, moon, stars, and planets. In celestial navigation, the navigator uses a sextant. What's that? A sextant measures the angle between the horizon and a celestial body like the sun, moon, or a star. A navigator like Fred Noonan would measure the angles and positions of more than one celestial body relative to his position. He would then compare those measurements with known celestial charts or almanacs, and that's how he could determine his latitude and longitude. This required a lot of skill, and even expert navigators could be a little off. Just being slightly off with your calculations could be disastrous in the middle of the ocean. Remember earlier when I told you that they meant to land in Dakar, Senegal, when they crossed the Atlantic from Brazil to Africa, but instead they landed in St. Louis, Senegal? It's okay to be a little off target when you are aiming for the second largest continent on Earth. But when you are looking for a tiny atoll like Howland Island, it could be disastrous. The United States government was assisting Earhart and Noonan in finding Howland Island. A Coast Guard cutter called the Itasca was stationed near Howland Island. It was there to help Earhart find that small piece of land. The Itasca would help with radio signals. When they were close, the ship would send up large amounts of black smoke, which would be visible for a long distance. That black smoke would be much easier to see than a tiny coral atoll. Now let's discuss the final leg of the journey. On the morning of July 2, 1937, Earhart and Noonan took off from Papua New Guinea, headed towards Howland Island. At this point, they had already flown approximately 22,000 miles or 35,000 kilometers over the past 6 weeks. They had approximately 7,000 miles or 11,000 kilometers to get back to California. The Electra was loaded with more fuel than it had ever carried. Earhart set the plane to a compass heading of 073 degrees directly towards Howland Island. Noonan recorded their takeoff time from Lae as 0000 Greenwich Mean Time. When you are crossing a lot of time zones, it's easier to just keep track in Greenwich Mean Time, which is the time at the prime meridian of Greenwich, England. They had arranged for a message to be sent from Lae to notify the Coast Guard cutter Itasca of their departure. Because of weather conditions, there were no radio reports received between the Electra and Harry Balfour, the radio operator back at Lae, for over 4 hours. But at 0418 Greenwich Mean Time, Balfour finally received a radio transmission from Earhart. She reported height 7,000 feet, speed 140 knots. Then she said something unintelligible regarding Lae. Then she said, everything okay. Because of the strong headwinds they were facing, Earhart increased the speed of the Electra to 140 knots. A knot, spelled K-N-O-T, is a speed measurement used by planes and ships. 1 knot equals 1.15 miles or 1.85 kilometers per hour. An hour later, Harry Balfour received a report from Earhart. Height, 10,000 feet. Position, 150.7 east, 7.3 south. Cumulus clouds, everything okay. Those coordinates meant that the Electra was 150.7 degrees east of the prime meridian of Greenwich, England, and 7.3 degrees south of the equator. At 0718 Greenwich Mean Time, Earhart reported over the radio, position 4.33 south, 1.59.7 east, height 8,000 feet over cumulus clouds, wind 23 knots. The Electra was right on the planned course to Howland Island. It seemed like everything was going according to plan, and Fred Noonan was doing an excellent job of navigating. Earlier I told you that the Coast Guard cutter Itasca was stationed near Howland Island. At 1745 Greenwich Mean Time, the Itasca received a message from Earhart that she was approximately 200 miles, which would be about 320 kilometers, from Howland Island. At 1815 Greenwich Mean Time, the Itasca received this message. Please take bearing on us and report in half hour. I will make noise in microphone about 100 miles out. The radio operator on the Itasca could hear Earhart, but it was clear that she could not hear radio reports from the Itasca because Earhart was not answering any questions from the Itasca radio operator. There are a lot of arguments and theories as to why this occurred and whether part of this was Earhart's fault. I don't think it really matters why this occurred, whether it was equipment failure or an error on her part. The important fact was that she could not hear any radio communications from the Itasca. The Lockheed Electra was outfitted with a radio direction finding loop antenna. If you look at any photos of the Electra, you'll see a small circle right above the cockpit. By rotating that loop antenna, she should have been able to locate the angle of any radio transmissions. Unfortunately, this system failed on that day, and there are arguments to this day as to why. I don't fully understand the science and engineering related to the radio transmissions, but I think this is a good summary from the U.S. Naval Institute website. Almost certainly, Amelia Earhart could not get a bearing on the radio beacon of the U.S. Coast Guard cutter Itasca lying off the beach at Howland Island because the frequency that she had designated, 7.50 megacycles, was so high that her direction finder was inherently incapable of taking bearings on it. The National Archives contains the radio log from the Itasca. Here are the last radio communications the Itasca received from Amelia Earhart. At 7:42 a.m. local time. We must be on you but cannot see you, but gas is running low. Been unable to reach you by radio. We are flying at 1,000 feet. At 8 o'clock a.m. We received your signals but unable to get a minimum. Please take bearing on us and answer 3105 with voice. That reference to a minimum was with regard to the loop antenna. It means that she could not lock in onto where the radio signals were coming from. If she could find the Itasca radio, she could fly in that exact direction to guide her into Howland Island. At 8:43 a.m., we are on the line 157-337. We will repeat this message. We will repeat this on 6210 kilocycles. Wait. That is usually considered the last radio message from Amelia Earhart. It is most likely that the Lockheed Electra ran out of fuel as Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan struggled to find Howland Island. They crashed into the vast Pacific Ocean and sank. That's most likely how they died. That was the official finding by the United States government and most historians today. Aviation and aerial navigation were both still in their infancy. When Earhart and Noonan missed finding Dakar, Senegal, earlier in the trip, there were plenty of places to still land in Africa. But when they missed tiny Howland Island, there was no place around them but endless ocean. After Earhart and Noonan went missing, the United States Navy conducted an extensive search from July 2 to July 18, 1937. They covered approximately 260,000 square miles or 673,000 square kilometers of the Pacific Ocean. The exploration included naval ships as well as airplanes. They did not find the Electra or either of the passengers. Over the years, there have been purported revelations supposedly solving the mystery of what happened to Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan. People claim that they found the missing evidence that explains it all. In 2017, the History Channel released a documentary titled Amelia Earhart, The Lost Evidence. The basis of that documentary was that Earhart and Noonan never made it to Howland Island. They crash-landed on the Marshall Islands, which were held by the Japanese at that time. And then they were held as prisoners because the Japanese believed that they were spies. I just measured on Google Maps. The distance from Howland Island to the Marshall Islands is approximately 1,000 miles or 1,600 kilometers. It's difficult to believe that they were that far off of their intended target. But the conspiracy people claim that Earhart and Noonan were actually spies on behalf of the American government. This was just before World War II, and there was a lot of tension between the United States and Japan. In fact, the date of their disappearance, July 2, 1937, was only 5 days before a full-scale war broke out between Japan and China. There is absolutely no evidence to support this theory. The whole basis of this claim was a photograph. It's a photo showing several people on a dock on Jaluit Atoll in the Marshall Islands. There is a woman seated with her back to the camera but looking to the side so you can see her profile. It was claimed that that was Amelia Earhart, and to her left is a man that was supposed to be Fred Noonan. There was only one problem. A Japanese military history blogger found the original source of the photo in the National Diet Library of Japan shortly after that History Channel documentary was first broadcast. That photo first appeared in a Japanese travelogue, which title translated to Lifeline of the Sea, My South Sea Memoir. That book was published in 1935, 2 years before Earhart and Noonan vanished. That whole theory was easily discredited. In January 2024, there was another claim that somebody had solved the mystery of what happened to Amelia Earhart. A South Carolina-based marine robotics firm called Deep Sea Vision published a sonar image of the bottom of the Pacific Ocean near Howland Island. The claim was that the image showed Earhart's Lockheed Electra. I got excited when I first heard about this discovery, but I was very disappointed when I saw the sonar image online and in the news. It's true that the image kind of looks like a plane, but not a propeller plane like the Lockheed Electra. The image looks like a jet with swept back wings. Propeller planes, like the Lockheed Electra, had wings that went straight out. So it did not seem to me, or a lot of other people, that this could have been her plane. 11 months after the big announcement, Deep Sea Vision released a statement that new sonar images from the company's underwater drone revealed that the image that they thought was Amelia Earhart's airplane turned out to be a rock formation. I very much appreciate that they made this announcement that they were wrong. The problem is that there are huge headlines around the world when somebody announces that they solved the mystery of Amelia Earhart, but the retractions stating that they were wrong get less attention. This brings us to the latest attention-grabbing theory that Earhart and Noonan landed on Gardner Island, which is now known as Nikomaroro Island. This is a small coral atoll. It's about 4.7 miles or 7.5 kilometers long and about 1.6 miles or 2.5 kilometers wide. It's part of the Phoenix Islands group and part of the country of Kiribati. Okay, I have to go off on a little tangent about this country. The name of that country is spelled Kiribati. For a long time, I thought it was pronounced Kiribati because I had only seen it written on maps, but it's actually pronounced Kiribati. Kiribati is an island country located in the Central Pacific. There are 33 islands in Kiribati, but only 20 are inhabited. There are only approximately 100,000 people living in that country. There's very little landmass because they are all small islands. The total landmass of all of the islands of Kiribati is 313 square miles or 811 square kilometers. And most of that is on one island, Tarawa, but the tiny landmass of Kiribati is spread out over 1.3 million square miles or 3.5 million square kilometers of ocean. That is an enormous area. Because its 33 islands are so spread out, Kiribati claims to be the only country in the world to span all 4 hemispheres. And of course you're asking, how could that be? It's because the country straddles the equator, so it covers the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere, and its islands are on both sides of the 180-degree meridian, known as the anti-meridian. That is on the exact opposite side of the globe from the prime meridian of Greenwich, England. The 180-degree meridian divides the eastern and western hemispheres in the Pacific. The international dateline mostly follows the 180-degree meridian, and I say mostly because it zigzags in different parts, so certain countries aren't split. Unfortunately, the 33 islands of Kiribati have an average elevation of only about 6.5 feet or 2 meters above sea level. As a result, the Republic of Kiribati is in danger of being totally wiped out if the ocean level rises due to climate change. Getting back to today's topic, Nikomaroro Island is now part of Kiribati. There are people that contend that Amelia Earhart landed her plane there, and that she and Fred Noonan survived on that island for a few days. This might be true, but at least right now they're basing this claim on pretty flimsy evidence. There are some physical items, like pieces of a glass jar which they believe contained freckle cream, part of a zipper, and parts of a shoe. But there's no evidence that Amelia Earhart even used freckle cream, and there's nothing that ties the pull from the zipper or the part of the shoe to Earhart or Noonan. Another piece of claimed evidence is a piece of aluminum found on Nikumaroro Island. The rivet holes in this segment of aluminum do not match the Lockheed Electra, so most historians believe that this piece of aluminum was not from Amelia Earhart's plane. The people that support the Nikumaroro theory say that this piece of aluminum might, maybe, possibly, be a metal patch that was put onto the plane during the course of the round-the-world flight. Most experts are skeptical, and there's no proof that it is the patch put on the Electra. In 1940, the British were trying to colonize Nikumaroro Island. A British officer found some human bones. That British officer shipped those bones to Dr. David Hoodless, principal of the Central Medical School of the South Pacific on Fiji. I could not find the actual report of Dr. Hoodless, but from everything I've read, that examining doctor determined that the bones were definitely male. Those bones have been lost over the years. However, without having the actual bones to examine, the experts hired by the people pushing the Nikumaroro Island theory have reviewed the notes from the 1940s exam and now claim that the bones were probably female. It's amazing that the doctor who examined the actual bones came to a totally different conclusion than the experts who have never seen the bones. Another point is that the British officer in 1940 did not find any clothes or hair near the bones, and the bones were severely weather-beaten and in poor condition. These factors would indicate that the bones had been there for a lot longer than the 3 years that had expired since Amelia Earhart went missing. If these bones belong to Amelia Earhart, where are the bones from Fred Noonan? Another argument for the Nikumaroro theory is based on the purported radio signals from Amelia Earhart after she went missing. It's unclear, but it seems it was mostly civilians who reported hearing these messages. The U.S. Naval and Coast Guard personnel who searched for Amelia Earhart for those 16 days were in the area and monitoring radio transmissions and did not receive any credible radio signals from Amelia Earhart after she was deemed missing. I am publishing this episode in June 2026. At this time, Purdue University is planning an expedition to examine the lagoon on Nikumaroro Island to look for Amelia Earhart's plane. This is a result of satellite imaging showing a shiny object that's in the lagoon. I very much hope that they find it. That would be fascinating. It would be wonderful if they found her plane, and that would change everything we know about Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan. However, based upon the evidence that's known today, I don't think that Earhart landed her plane on Nikumaroro Island for several grounds. Reason number one, this Nikumaroro Island theory has been argued since the late 1980s. That island has been searched many times over the past 38 years, and they've found no definitive evidence that Earhart or Noonan were ever on that island. Reason number two, in 1991, Robert Ballard led an expedition to Nikumaroro Island. If that name sounds familiar, it's because he's the guy who led the team that found the Titanic in 1985. And in 2002, Ballard's team found a torpedo tube from John Kennedy's PT-109 on the bottom of the Pacific. That was a pretty small item to find, yet he found it. Ballard spent 2 weeks examining the waters off of Nikumaroro Island. They used the most up-to-date equipment, including underwater sonar mapping, along with underwater crafts which examined with video cameras. Scuba divers were sent into certain areas that seemed promising. You know what they found? Nothing. While Ballard's team searched the waters where the plane might be located, archaeologists inspected the island itself, and they even used search dogs. And what did they find? Nothing. Reason number 3. I just measured on Google Maps the distance between Howland Island and Nicomararo is 407 miles or 654 kilometers. According to Earhart's last radio broadcast to the Itasca, she and Noonan believed that they were somewhere close to Howland Island. The theory is that when Earhart and Noonan could not find Howland, they flew until they found another island. The last radio messages from Earhart said, "We are on the line 157-337. She did not say which direction they were heading on that line, north or south. If they were heading south, that would take them to Nicomararo Island. I think that is the best argument for the people who claim this theory. However, we don't know how fast they were flying at the time, but it's estimated that she was traveling at approximately 130 knots as she was trying to find Howland Island. If she was flying anywhere close to that estimated speed, it would take her almost 3 hours to fly the over 400 miles or 650 kilometers to reach Nicomararo Island. It's difficult to believe that they would fly almost 3 hours in a straight line away from the place where they believed Howland Island was located and end up at Nicomararo Island. Also, she was reporting that they were almost out of gas. Did she have enough fuel to travel another 400 miles? Unlikely. Reason number 4. Since the 1800s, fleets of pearl boats have been in the part of the Pacific around Gardner and later called Nicomararo Island. They would camp on shore as they spent days or weeks hunting for pearls and oysters in the surrounding waters. In 1892, people tried to establish a coconut plantation on that island. In 1929, a British steamship named the SS Norwich City ran aground on the reef around Nicomararo. Some members of the crew died, but many survived until they were rescued. In 1939, the British tried to establish a colony on that island, and in 1944 and 1945, there was a U.S. Coast Guard station there. The point of all this is that evidence of human habitation could have come from any of those people who visited or lived on that island over the years. Reason number 5. On July 9, 1937, 3 different search planes from the American battleship USS Colorado flew over Gardner Island. They flew as low as 400 feet or 122 meters over the island. There were no signs of the Electra or of any people. I was unable to find the actual log from the USS Colorado regarding the search. I really wanted to read the original log. However, the U.S. Naval Institute website states that a pilot on one of those 3 search planes reported, "Here, signs of recent habitation were clearly visible, but repeated circling and zooming failed to elicit any answering wave from possible inhabitants, and it was finally taken for granted that none were there." The captain of the USS Colorado contradicted that statement in his official report, stating no signs of habitation were seen on Gardner, now known as Nicomararo Island. As far as I could find, the other pilots did not state that they saw any signs of recent habitation on the island. And I think the most telling fact of all is that they did not see any bodies on the island. Even if Earhart and Noonan died by July 9th, when the planes flew over the island, that was only a few days after they supposedly made radio messages. If they died within a few days, the bodies should have been seen on the island where the alleged signs of habitation were located. I know that the people who believe in the Nicomararo theory say that the coconut crabs on the island might have eaten the bodies, but did they eat everything that there was nothing for these pilots to see? Did the coconut crabs eat the clothes, shoes, every remnant of these 2 people? I truly wish that Amelia Earhart's Lockheed Electra is someday found. I very much hope that the expedition from Purdue University to Nicomararo Island, scheduled for later this year, finds the airplane. I think most people hope so. We would love to know exactly where she and Fred Noonan ended up. And I don't say this without keeping in mind that this was a tragedy that befell two human beings. Nevertheless, all lovers of history want to eliminate any mysteries, and I'd be happy if the plane was found around Nicomararo Island and we would now have concrete evidence as to what happened. I, and any reasonable person, would reevaluate their theories as to what occurred on that flight. But until such evidence is found, the scenario I presented in this episode seems most likely for the evidence we now have. And based upon the verified documents and data that we currently have, and until actual contrary evidence is discovered, I side with the findings by the United States government based upon all of the reasons I outlined earlier. I believe that Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan could not find Howland Island. They ran out of fuel, crashed into the vast Pacific Ocean, and died. The plane sank in deep water and may never be found. That's it for today. Please subscribe to this podcast. If you are listening on a podcast app which allows ratings, I would greatly appreciate a 5-star rating. Reviews really help. Spotify allows comments and reviews of a particular episode. On Apple Podcasts, simply scroll down the History Analyzed show page, select a rating, and then tap Write a Review. Please tell your friends, relatives, coworkers. Word of mouth is the best way to increase the audience for History Analyzed. Check out my website, historyanalyzed.com, where you will find links to fun items for history geeks. Thank you for listening. Catch you next episode.